All right, so all that stuff's correct. But World War II, we're going to have even a little more opportunity for minorities and a little more opportunity for women. If it plays right. All right, so the first thing I've got here is there's a lot of, which remember, it wasn't that way before the war started. Before the war started, I told you we were ranked somewhere around 14th in the world as far as the size of our military. And now unemployment, which had been up to 25% during the Great Depression, drops to 1.2%. So, you know, the Hoover Dam, the CCC, the Works Progress Administration, all those things help people get jobs, but none of it did near as much as World War II. Yes?
So what are they going to do when the war is over and they don't need all these?
We're going to get to that. Yeah, it's going to cause a problem, especially when all these GIs come home and need jobs. Some people were forced to give up their jobs in the factories, and this is also why Congress passed the GI Bill to help the people come home from the war get education. All right, but Roosevelt promised in 1941 in his State of the Union address that he was going to help the U.S. fight for 4 freedoms around the world. It's called freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech. He said this should guide U.S. policy both at home and abroad. And Norman Rockwell did a series of 4 paintings about these. That first one's supposed to show freedom from fear. Will one of y'all get the lights, please? And freedom of speech. When have we talked about abridging freedom of speech in America? Or when has the government abridged freedom of speech? Yeah, that's fine.
Lincoln suspended habeas corpus.
All right, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He took away a little bit of freedom of speech. He could put people in jail for whatever. What else? I was saying somebody's going to say something back to John Adams' administration. Do we remember the Alien and Sedition Acts? Alien and Sedition Acts, which said you couldn't say bad stuff about the government. Then the Espionage and Sedition Acts in World War I. All right, I'm sure that freedom from want didn't necessarily mean everybody's going to get a 5-course meal around the world, but he wanted everybody to at least have the basic necessities of life. All right, the first big trend is going to be women gain employment. That poster says, "My girl's a wow." He's holding up that Rosie the Riveter image. Women became 35% of the workforce just because the men were away fighting. But women's ordnance workers were people that were doing jobs that were usually men's type of industrial work. And I've got here that a lot of them were forced or encouraged to give up their jobs after the war, so that kind of answers your question, Lisa. The women got jobs, but after the war they were either fired or strongly encouraged to give them up to the soldiers' return home. This is the famous image from the war. And remember, we looked at that World War I poster where it was the Navy girl saying, "Gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy." Now you've got more of a strong woman. She's flexing her muscles, showing her bicep, and showing that she can do just as much heavy work as men can.
Because it wasn't World War II that women were actually allowed into the military.
Yes. And how many of y'all seen A League of Their Own?
Yep.
All right, Morgan. It's a movie that came out in, I think, the late 90s, mid-90s maybe. But it's got Madonna in it. It's about the All-American Girls Baseball League. And, you know, not just average people were drafted into the war, but some famous baseball players too. Well, to cover the slowdown in professional men's sports, they did put professional women's sports out there. And you notice these women are wearing short dresses. They were doing what they could to try to get audiences in the stands for this girls' baseball league. And it wasn't a softball league. This is girls playing like regular fast-pitch baseball. The population moved, just like during World War I. World War I, we talked about a lot of minorities moving from the south to the north and Midwest. World War II, all the towns had defense industries. Their population jumped big time. One of the main ones I know of was Mobile, Alabama. They had a shipyard there, I believe it was, so a lot of people moved there. And then society kind of has to change because you have fewer young men at home. Why would the number of marriages go up when you go into a war?
A lot of marriage numbers go up. So, you know, the male and the female could...
Okay, but why, if the men are away from home, are more people getting married?
Oh,
Lisa.
it's made.
Because people are going to die more, so they trying to make up for that.
Yeah, that's a good point. People are going to die during the war. Let's say if a man was at basic training, he met a local girl, and they started dating, and what normally might be a romance that would drag out over months or years, they might rush things. And let's say he knows he's shipping out next week to Europe, they might hurry up and rush the marriage. But also some of these rush marriages were broken off with Dear John letters. Yeah.
Because they also, if the women were like the equivalent of, I guess, when they go there, they would do it for the benefits.
Yeah, they could get benefits if the soldier died. But Congress realized that these soldiers coming home from war would have to readjust, so they passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill, which is why some people talk about going into the military to pay for college today. Yeah.
I have some question. What's GI stand for?
Can you help me with that?
Because
Mr. Casper, do you remember?
Government issue.
Government issue. There we go.
I know the post 9/11 GI Bill is what helps a lot of them now.
Yeah.
Back then.
I mean, it's the same GI Bill, I think. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's the same act that helps them today. Anybody know what this would mean? All right, you hung those in your window if you had somebody serving in the military in your family. That was a way. And for every person you had serving, there would be an extra star. So, you got 2 people serving, you got 2 stars on the flag. To finance the war, the government did the same stuff it did during World War I, selling savings bonds. So it encouraged people to buy war bonds and thinking that, if you can't enlist and fight yourself, at least you can maybe go and purchase war bonds to help the military. There's a commemorative stamp from several years back for the GI Bill. Again, putting this image out there that it's the GI Bill that helps returning soldiers get an education. We know that the Civil Rights Movement wasn't completed by this time. We've talked about it all the way back to really the end of the Civil War. Well, in the 1940s, most businesses were still segregated. The South was still very thoroughly segregated. So this guy here, James Farmer, founded something called Congress on Racial Equality, which we'll come up to several times when we get to the 1960s Civil Rights Movement, or 50s and 60s when we talk about Martin Luther King Jr. But he started this to confront urban segregation, and this was one of the first groups to use sit-ins to do things like try to desegregate lunch counters. And when you had massive population shifts, you had massive conflict a lot of times. In the summer of 1943, there were a lot of race riots in Detroit, such a big national problem that you've got this making the cover of Time magazine. And most of the things we think of the Civil Rights Movement, like images that maybe we've seen in magazines of people getting fire hoses turned on them or police attack dogs attacking marchers, that's usually 1950s and 60s, but there were problems in the 40s too. And I don't know how many of y'all have heard of a song called Zoot Suit Riot. Anybody heard that? All right. Well, zoot suits were worn by Mexican Americans in Los Angeles in the 1940s. And eventually, they were the cause of a lot of stereotypical racist conflict at the time. Why would that suit, which is a zoot suit, be something that would cause people to want to call Mexican Americans unpatriotic? All right, nothing to do with the color. Look at the sizing. Look at the sizing of the suit. All right, it's extra big. What were people encouraged to do during World War II? Conserve things. So it's like an excessive use of fabric. So it's like a small way to say that you're kind of protesting the war effort, protesting the government, because you're kind of doing the opposite of what the government's recommending people do. And during World War II is when Japanese Americans were put in internment camps. We usually think of the term concentration camps with Nazis and the Holocaust. We had concentration camps in the United States too. Now they weren't like work and death camps, but it was basically because of irrational prejudice from Americans. After Pearl Harbor, I told you there were like Time magazine articles talking about how can you tell your friends who are supposed to be the Chinese from the Japs. So there was a lot of racism towards Japanese people, but also a lot of fear that something else might happen. And again, it's newspapers, magazines, things like this that stirred up this racist propaganda. And Japanese Americans were seen as people that maybe they had been here for 3 generations or something. Maybe it was somebody whose great-grandparents had come from Japan. But they were still seen as somebody that might be a threat to America by a lot of people on the West Coast.
You just say something about them, or like you didn't like people that are Japanese, just say something and then have put in. I'm going to tell you how they figured out who got put in there. Roosevelt issued an executive order. Executive orders
pretty much had the force of law. Executive Order 9066 in 1942 said that as a measure of national security, all persons of Japanese ancestry, this could be somebody that was born in the United States and was a U.S. citizen, if they lived in California, Washington, Oregon, or Arizona, were moved to concentration camps for national security.
He allowed that?
Yes, he signed this. The thought being that maybe they would try to send information back to Japan, maybe they would try to sabotage military installations or shipyards along the California coastline or something like that. So what?
It was just being paranoid.
Yeah, it was basically people being paranoid, you're right. But I've got to hear that.
Kind of protecting them from being killed by the other.
Well, I don't usually think of it as being protected, but I guess that's one way to look at it. But there were 110,000 Japanese Americans that were sent to these relocation centers, which were in effect prison camps. And when you got the order to go, you had to go pretty quickly. So it's not like you had time to make sure all your belongings were taken care of. Maybe you would have a kind neighbor who was going to look after your house or your belongings or something. But most people had to sell everything they owned very cheap and get out quick. You look at this dark line along the California border going up into Washington, Oregon. If you lived to the west of that line, you were sent to a relocation camp. East of the line, you were fine. You weren't moved. And it's actually because the guy that was the military commander in charge of the West Coast freaked out. Even Japanese Americans living in Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor happened, were not relocated. But only people living right on that side of that line. And you see these triangles of the relocation centers, and obviously they're going to be further inland. They wanted to get these Japanese Americans as far from the coast as they could. And it is a prison camp, but again, it's not a concentration like death camp like the Nazis, because you see here kids playing ball outside of a school. So it was almost like they were on house arrest. Yeah.
Couldn't the Japanese just kind of get in their cars and go to like the edge of the, or like past the line?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you, Calvin, how that would have worked. But right here you see a family that's probably carrying everything they could carry into a camp. And, you know, some people would think, well, if you're an American citizen, this is probably seeming unconstitutional. So it was challenged in court. A guy named Fred Korematsu sued, and the case made it to the Supreme Court. And in 1944, the Supreme Court said this is okay. They said it is not a violation of the Constitution to do this as a measure for national security. Yeah, he was in the camp. And the Japanese American Citizens League had pushed the government for years to compensate Japanese for the years lost to their lives. And eventually they were awarded restitution. And President Reagan signed the bill that was going to give $20,000 to every Japanese American that was sent to a relocation camp. But you got to look at this. The checks were sent in 1990. They started putting people in the camps in the 1940s. So these are over 45 years later, you get a check for $20,000. Do y'all think the check for $20,000 45 years down the road would be fair means for giving up 3 years of your life?
Probably back then.
Okay, the checks are sent in 1990.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, think about the value of $20,000 in 1990, yeah.
Well, they might not feel that it's really justice for them, but if they take it, that means they can use it for like their children or their
Okay, maybe so. And I believe President Clinton issued like a formal apology letter to Japanese Americans for this. But again, I want you to remember this is not something that happened across the whole United States, and it's not something that happened for any good reason. It's kind of irrational paranoia. But again, if you were living in Hawaii where we already had been attacked by the Japanese, you were fine. But if you lived in somewhere like San Francisco, you were sent to a relocation center. And it was my college professor who told us that it was basically because the military commander of that district in America freaked out while others stayed calm. You gonna like this?